Here we are. Good to go. Good evening, everyone. My name is Kirk Downing. I'm Superintendent of Schools here in NASHOBA Regional School District. I want to thank you all for coming out for our presentation on the building project that we are proposing to the Massachusetts Building Association, MSBA, Massachusetts School Building Association. So tonight we're going to be talking about an update on the project, the schedule, the educational program, some of the building concepts, and upcoming items. And I'll allow our guests to introduce themselves as we go through the night. And I think I'm turning it over immediately. Oh, I should recognize our chair of the building committee, Attorney Joe Gleason. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Marianne Williams or Craig or... Okay, so Marianne Williams with Skanska, our project manager.
Thank you. Good evening. Hope everybody's doing well. You just gotta put it close to your mouth. Just closer, right? Okay. So thank you for coming out tonight. We did want to talk about the project schedule that we have going on right now. We're in the process of submitting what they call the preliminary design program. It's actually a report of the work we've been doing since last, I want to say, late December, early January. And the schedule you see on the screen above, excuse my back a little bit, you'll see that we're completing what they call Module 3A, Preliminary Design Program. What we've been doing is really verifying the existing conditions of the current high school, in the process of educational visioning and developing the educational plan, which is really the basis of design. It's the guiding document that gives instruction and direction to the design team so that they're able to really have the mission of the school, the goals of the schools to come to fruition through the building and the practices that take place there. You'll see later on that we'll present some site options evaluations and also really be presenting in about a week the preliminary design program report to the school committee and school building committee. So at that, looking at the next steps, which comes after the submission, the Mass School Building Authority has 30 days to review the report, confirm that we've done our due diligence, that we've done a true feasibility study, and really what I would call the invisible work that allows the project to move forward. The next step, over the summer into October, you'll see that we'll be developing options for new construction, renovation addition, and renovation. So what we're doing in this development is that next stage will be developing the building systems options that will be in each of the different options. We'll be looking at sustainability. There was actually a gentleman here who is familiar with the Acton-Boxborough project, which is a triple net zero project, which we're looking to bring some of those principles forward with this project as well. We'll then be developing a preliminary budget, which is really an order of magnitude budget. You know, their square foot costs. We're making sure that all of the programming is accounted for, but it's really a conceptual level, and it gives us an opportunity to really begin to put together space diagrams of what the school might look like. And then the last is evaluate and selected preferred option. And what that means is, you know, right now we've looked at several options. We're narrowing it down to 3 going into the next stage. And then eventually we'll have multiple iterations of some of those options as we keep evaluating and getting feedback. It's an iterative process. And then at the end of that, we'll really have to limit it down to one option, which would be the preferred schematic option. And that would lead us into schematic design. Each of these steps in the process requires Mass School Building Authority approval. It's a great process, it's a linear process, and we can't move forward until they've reviewed the reports. It's a peer review. they'll actually have another architectural firm look at it, and they'll vet our assumptions and give us feedback, which is a great opportunity for all of us. And then once we submit the preferred schematic report and we move into schematic design, we will have narrowed it down to that this is the building and concept that we want, whether it's, again, new, renovation addition. So I don't know if you want to add anything more to that, or? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. So my name's Craig Olson. I'm a project manager with Casaboo's Associates, the architect for the project. I'm also going to just introduce some of the team that's here tonight. Joe Milani, to my right, is the project architect, and Kate Jessup is the educational planner with Casaboo's. She'll be talking a little bit. But what we did want to just touch upon and build upon what Marianne had just mentioned is that this is our third public forum. The first two focused on the educational visioning that occurred back in February, trying to understand what the potential and where education is going and can go in NASHOBA Regional, as well as the existing conditions. And that's really what this phase in the project we're about is an investigation and evaluation phase. And now we're just starting to get into the exploration phase and the development of options, which is what we're here to talk about tonight. And so saying that we are just scratching the surface, we're just getting started, and we're going to develop more options as we go along. But tonight is just to kind of bring the group along and allow people to ask questions, as well as as we develop the options to learn from what comments that we might get tonight as we try to develop the building, to make sure we capitalize at all the civic opportunities that this project has as a flagship to the communities. So from that standpoint, I'm really going to turn it over to Kate Jessup, who's our educational planner, to talk about some of the work that we've been doing with the educational leadership here at NASHOBA Regional, and how that's kind of guiding us and leading us into the building concepts.
Hi, everybody. So my role in the project is really to bridge between the educators and and understanding how that is facilitated in architecture. So although we'll have a more robust programming phase where we're getting really into a lot of details down the line and in sort of the future phases that Marianne was mentioning before, we do take the opportunity at this point, after we have our high-level visioning, to meet again with a set of leadership members in order to understand some of the physical adjacencies that are important in the building. And that's really because we want to make sure that education is leading the design of this project. Ultimately, we have a great site here, but there are some physical restrictions, so we want to make sure that we are designing the space relationships that are needed for educational opportunities while not hamstringing them by putting them on a certain part of the site. So a lot of the work that we've been doing so far is creating that leadership group. We've met about 10 times over the past 10 weeks, looking at different groups. Within that, the members of that group, there have been folks from all different types of disciplines and who have been involved in all of the conversations. So it's really a group discussion between educational stakeholders so that we can all work together towards a solution that works for everyone. Basically, we have been trying to just understand those physical relationships and what space needs there are. So oftentimes, we come in and we look at the space that is in the building here now, but just because it's what a program is utilizing does not mean that that's the ideal place or spaces that that program wants to be in. So through these conversations, we learn a lot about aligning to that, what is the education in school here going to be like in 10, 20 years, and understanding how a program may grow and what programs may not exist now that want to be added to the school. So through this, you can see a list of meetings on the left-hand side, just a select grouping of them. We really developed this bubble diagram you see on the right here. And this helps us to understand, not in architecture, but really in relationships, the types of spaces that want to exist. So you can see, which one's the pointer? There we go. So you can see really we developed a concept where coming in, having sort of these large shared spaces, similar to how you have it on this side entrance into the school, having a welcoming entry for your public in the front of the building. having this central core, we talked about a living atrium, a space that would really enliven the students, connect them to the physical environment that the school sits in. And that really becomes more than a cafeteria. It's a space where students socialize, they have some of that social emotional support, and that was really one of the guiding principles that came out of visioning. So understanding how that relates to space was really important. And this tissue, this band of media center, we had this concept where the media center would permeate through every aspect of the learning environments, which is really exciting for us as architects and designers to find out ways that we can physically manifest that into happening in the building. And then, of course, understanding these small learning communities. We talked in the visioning about interdisciplinary education and the idea of science and math working together, and English and social studies, and everyone working on these collaborative projects. And a lot of ways that we can organize those space breaks up these small learning communities into groupings of multiple different types of classrooms. So rather than a departmental model, going towards something that reflects a little bit more of what we're seeing in our industry now. So here you can see in this diagram, again, we sort of took a whole meeting where we just talked about what would be in these 4 small learning communities. You know, we talked about the idea of having these breakout spaces in the center where projects and exciting physical activity can happen. We talked about the relationships between science and classrooms and physical connections, and these small group rooms coming throughout so that kids could break out of a larger classroom environment if they needed a smaller, quieter environment to work. And all sorts of other activities can happen in those, from testing to anything. So that was really an exciting development that we came through, and as you can see, we worked through how we look at the applied arts and STEAM integration with your visual arts programs. We talked about health and wellness, so we focused in on special education, but also the idea of just wellness in general. So how can that permeate from your curriculum into your physical space, as well as focusing in on some of the more dedicated special education spaces, really understanding that a rising tide raises all boats. So how can we make sure that those spaces for those learners are designed appropriately and they're in the right place in the building? And then just yesterday, we met with athletics and wellness and PE to really understand the needs for that type of curriculum, and how, again, wellness is more than just PE class. There's a lot that goes into it. So these are just some of the things that we learned through the process. And I'm going to turn it back over to Craig, because eventually we get to a very, very tidy document, which is a reflection of all of these conversations in the bubbles.
Thank you, Kate. So what is up on the screen now is not as exciting as the bubbles that you saw earlier. What Kate was showing are what we call bubble diagrams, which are more intent to define a type of space, what it's located near, and how it's related. But this is more of the meat and potatoes side of things, where we talk about how big the building is, what types of spaces, how many spaces they are, and what size they are. And so in the state of Massachusetts, the MSBA has what they call their space summary guidelines, which we put in forth a very consolidated version of them up on the screen tonight, which is based on what the proposed enrollment for 925 students is. And so what they're saying is that, as an example, at 925 students, a model school would have 32 classrooms, and they would be about 850 square feet, and that's based on an 85% utilization rate, which is a national standard. And so I won't go into great detail on all these because it's really not that exciting, other than it does build everything together as we develop a school. But what I do want to get into is more of some of the comparisons as we look at the current NASHOBA Regional High School versus a new project, and what the comparison would look like for that. So what you're seeing up here is we've started to put a category of what the existing school is against what the guidelines are. And so a few things that we just do want to highlight as we look at this is, in current education versus when we went to school, a lot of us back in our time, is that education was more about desks sitting in a row. Now we're more collaborative, so it needs more space. So when you look at that, the average size classroom in the current high school is around 686 square feet, where a new school or under current standards is 850 square feet. So you can see there's a large delta, almost 200 square feet in difference of just this current school versus what education standards are currently. Other items that you can notice that are large elements would be your gymnasium. Again, while you have 2 gymnasiums, neither of them are the actual size of what a recommended school would be. And then finally, the room that we're sitting in now, again, you can see that the stage and the auditorium are undersized compared to current standards. And I say that at the same time because of the efficiency of the way schools function now, is that if we were to start a building from scratch, just saying at 925 students, it would be 185 students using guidelines. But your building, for instance, is 202,000 square feet. So what that's telling us is there's a lot of inefficiencies in your current school. And if inefficiencies add to cost, long-term costs as far as energy efficiency, there's space that are underutilized. So those are all things that we consider as we look at this, as we are looking from a feasibility study to find the most fiscally responsible and educationally appropriate solution. So getting into that, we also want to talk about the evaluation that we talked in the previous public forum about the existing high school site, and that is being the most appropriate site for the project. And so we put this up here just to remind everybody about some of the constraints that we're working with, being the wetlands that you can see along here, the existing high school here, as well as the pipeline that comes across the site through here. And so as we start to look at evaluating the different options for the project, there are 4 key options that we're going to be evaluating through the process. And we're going to start the discussion tonight and continue it for the next 6 months, basically, through this process. The first one is what we'll call the option 1, the base repair code upgrade option. That is our baseline option. That is where we're evaluating what it takes to take this building and bring it up to current code and energy efficiency standards. And that is it. It doesn't change any of the educational program aspects of the building. It doesn't fix any of the educational deficiencies. It's just bringing the building up to current code standards. Option 2 is now looking at this building is what do we have to do to change this building to meet the educational program, to address the educational deficiencies. Option 3 is then, okay, how can we then modify this building, whether it's demolishing and putting additions on, to then further develop that from an educational programming to, again, find what's the most fiscally responsible, educationally appropriate solution. And finally, the fourth is if evaluating what the cost would be for new construction. If we did a brand new building on the site and addressed everything, how much would that cost? And as part of our evaluation, then we're going to look at each of those, excuse me, what the total project cost would be, and then evaluate what the MSBA share for that cost would be based on the reimbursement rate, which would then allow us to understand what the district share would be. And through this investigation and evaluation, we'll be able to educate you as a public what the costs are of the building for all the different options, so that an educated decision can be made on what is, again, the ultimate goal of the feasibility study, to find what the most educationally appropriate and fiscally responsible solution is. And from that, through working with the educational leadership, as Kate has mentioned, working with the teachers, the students, the staff, the public, your feedback from tonight, we look to develop those projects to find out what that ultimate solution is. So to start that discussion, we are, like I mentioned, just scratching the surface. We're just starting to explore them in the past month, and this, as we're going to explore through to basically Christmas, is evaluating what the pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages of each option are. So Option one, as we know, is this is your existing building. We're currently up here in the auditorium with the gymnasium, the academic wings. Is option one, obviously repairs the building. It fixes any problems the building might have that we reviewed, is part of the existing conditions evaluation in Public Forum 1. The cons to it is obviously it doesn't meet the education program. It doesn't fix any of the educational deficiencies. Construction activity would occur while the students are in school, throughout the school year, for multiple years. It wouldn't change any of the undersized educational spaces that I had mentioned before. And it would require, like I mentioned, an extended timeline. And in addition to that, because it doesn't address the educational deficiencies in the building, it wouldn't be eligible for reimbursement from the MSBA. Because that's one of the items is we have to find the educationally appropriate solution as well. So we have to address the educational deficiencies. So we use this as our baseline just to understand what it costs just to fix the building. So this it would be almost, in a sense, what we would call the do-nothing approach other than fixing the building. Option two, which would be renovating this building, which would, all the items that we said that I mentioned in option one would happen, other than the fact that we would be looking to see if we can make this building fit the educational program. Now, that doesn't mean it can. We're going to be just evaluating and exploring to see if it can, and if it can, how much that would cost to do. And in doing that, then it would make basically option one become an reimbursable option. Option three would be then an addition renovation option, where we would then evaluate, and for instance, this is an early idea that we're exploring, is what could we do to the existing building through demolishing areas and then putting additions on in strategic locations to address the deficiencies educationally, but also be very cost effective in doing this. So things that we're looking at doing, and when we're doing this, is trying to create a compact envelope, and that addresses some of the inefficiencies that I had talked about as far as the oversize of the current building. And so in doing that, we look at the big inefficiencies, as we looked at that space summary, is the academic classrooms, which are really these two wings here, as well as the large corridors that connect them that give you those inefficiencies. So we look at as, okay, if we can address those through a demolition and putting an addition onto the building that addresses those in an educationally appropriate way, giving the appropriately sizes and a compact, what would that look like? And so that's what this evaluation is. And when we talk about these options, I want to say is it's not just one addition renovation options. It could be multiple. We're looking to explore, okay, this is one idea. What if we did it another way? What would that look like? And it's each iteration as we go, as we explore. It's an exploratory phase. And then when we look at option 4, the new construction, we know that the size of the building, and we're going to be building it and designing it to the current space standards and guidelines in the state and in the nation for education. And in doing that, we look at, okay, and we've broken it up here as some of the options that we've begun to explore already. As option 4A here being placing a building right behind on the track, and what that would look like is we know the building will fit. We know that it fits within all the constraints, and so we're going to start to explore that as far as the adjacencies, and then it's going to turn into other iterations and other iterations. But our first exploration was, where can we put a building of this size on the site? And that's what we're showing up here tonight, is what if we put a building of this size here? What if we put a building of this size up here? Or what if we put a building of this size up here? What we learned in doing that, based through even our recent investigations, is while we could fit a building up in this site, it would be very tight. We'd be putting a building right up against the neighborhoods, as well as we'd be putting it right across the pipeline, which we've learned through the easement process and discussions with the pipeline company, is there are some constraints that would make that fairly cost prohibitive to try to build a building on the other side of the pipeline. It's ideal for what it is, suits right now is just as athletic fields. And then we also looked at, could we place a building over on the south side of the pipeline, but over where the parking lot is over here and the baseball field. And again, in our exploration of putting this building here, is it does encroach, there's multiple constraints, whether it's the current septic system, there is wetlands there, so there's multiple constraints. And again, this is an early phase of it, so we're not ruling out placing a building in this area of the building, but what we have looked at is placing the most compact building in that location. So we might have to now take a building and have it become a little more linear, less efficient from a building standpoint, but it doesn't mean it's not the right solution. And those are the things we're going to start to explore further as we go along, is different building shapes and placing them on the site to find out what the solution is. And through that, it's a testing against all the educational program, cost estimates, so that then we have a variety of options, so then we can further evaluate and do our due diligence to make sure that the solution that is ultimately selected to further develop and to become in schematic design is what is the most fiscally responsible and educationally appropriate solution. So I know that we went through fairly quickly tonight through this stuff because we're really early in it, but we've done a lot of work to get to here. But it's at that point now where we're really looking for feedback from the public to hear what you have to say to help guide us as we look at things. That you might have questions that spark ideas, interest that we have not thought of yet, as well as whether there's questions just as far as the development of the project to make sure that we're considering everything that needs to be considered for the project. So at this point, we'll kind of turn it over to a question and answer session. If anybody has any questions, comments. Yep, I'll repeat the question for everybody to hear, and then answer the question. The question was, has it been determined that the existing high school site is the site for the project? And the answer is, through our evaluations, is yes. It will be included in our report and our summary, and we presented it through the building committee meetings, as well as a recent public forum. The investigation we went through for the site evaluation is what is the ideal site for it, and we developed a criteria, and criteria included whether it was the appropriate size, it met the district regional agreement for location, as well as a priority to a district-owned site. And ultimately, the high school site was the only one that met that criteria. But we also still evaluated the site to make sure it would still work under those standpoints. And ultimately, the reason the criteria for it being a high school district-owned property is part of the process is if it was determined that a property that wasn't district-owned was the best property, it would require the district to procure that property in advance of this project. So that would be additional monies that would need to be spent for a property to procure, and then that could potentially delay the project in that timeline, which time is money, especially in the world we're living in today. And second to that is before a project could even be approved. So if the money was spent to procure the property that each town would have to approve, then the project does not get approved, then the district would be owning a property that they're not developing and would have to maintain. So that was one of the key reasons is establishing that criteria.
And just so you know, the school district doesn't own any of the properties.
Oh, okay.
The towns own the properties. And so if, for instance, we found a location, whether it's in Bolton or Lancaster or Stowe, that town would have to hold an election to purchase that piece of property, not knowing if we're ever approved for a project to begin with. So the school district doesn't possess any of those capital assets. They belong to the town.
Thank you for that.
I'll take this moment to also remind or anyone who is viewing online, you can type a question into the chat, and Dr. Boynton is monitoring the chat to see if we have any questions from the public that are viewing online.
No questions yet. Go ahead.
Yep. So when we look at these, they all have various options, but traditionally when we do a new construction project, it's a 3-year construction timeline, 2 years to actually build the building, and then 1 year is demolishing the old building and building the athletic field. So that would be traditionally what you would see for a new construction project. For instance, when we looked at the addition renovation option, this could potentially be a 5-year project, even 5 to 6 year, depending on how the phasing would work out, because it's about moving the kids around through that, and there is disruption to the students through the school year. And when you add it over 5 to 6 years, it's quite a disruption, and that's something which is why it's important when we talk about this, is what's also the educationally appropriate, not long-term, but short-term as well for the kids that are here, and being considerate to that. So those are all items that will be considered as the committee ultimately selects what's the most appropriate solution.
And it's important to note, too, that when the project happened, the last project, which happened on this portion of the school many, many years ago, many of your teachers are actual former students, they're alumni. So we've actually had a lot of discussions about the challenges that they had as students during that. So just that does weigh into the factor, is that if we're doing piles or any sort of heavy construction, it's very noisy, and it would be very disruptive for students. So from an educational standpoint, obviously that's something we have to weigh. And when you're looking at either an ad reno or a renovation or new construction, is that there are a lot of elements that play into it. It's not just costs. Ultimately, there is that long timeline, but it's also having a lot of construction activity right outside your science classroom. And given that it would be more than 4 years that would happen, it would be the entire duration of some kids' high school experience. And so that is just something that we want to make sure we consider in all these elements that go into the decision making on the part of those making the choices.
Got a question from Nikki McGatchie. Where would the athletes play if new construction took place on the existing field?
I guess I'll take that one. Huh?
I could answer it, but
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
no. The answer is we don't have a good answer to that yet. That we had the meeting, as Kate had mentioned yesterday, where we started those discussions with athletics. Is there's different options that could exist, whether it's could they play on the existing site and we work around those parameters? Could they play on a separate field in the district? And so there isn't a finite answer, a concrete answer at this point, and that's really what our discussions were about even yesterday. Is brainstorming what those could be. It's been done many different ways within the district. I mean, within the Commonwealth. This is a common thing that we see as architects through this process. Is normally the existing high school site is the most ideal site, and really the only place to build it is on the athletic fields. So, and every district deals with it differently. It's still very early in the process for that. As I mentioned, we just started conversations with the athletic department yesterday. There isn't an answer for it yet, other than that we've started discussions and are exploring the different alternatives that could exist for it.
Well said. I would just add to that that would push us to a point to work with town officials on some town synergies in terms of how town-based athletic fields are being utilized, and and the long-term capital plan with those towns as well. Perhaps there's some partnerships that we could have temporarily over a period of time while we're in construction phase. But as Mr. Olson stated, we're way ahead of that moment in time, but it is on our minds as a solution that would have to be crafted.
It's also important to note that typically in a project, not all of the fields are displaced during the construction process. So it's not as if all of the athletics in the fields would stop at that point. So it would likely be if you're building a building on the baseball field or if you're building it on the track, certainly that there would be disruption to those programs that utilize that space, but it wouldn't be all of them. So we obviously would have to work through all of that, as we've all mentioned, but it's not as if all of the athletics would be out of a home.
A good example of that is, and I'm proud to announce, our ladies lacrosse team won their playoff match this afternoon, advanced to the Final Four. None of our other fields were being utilized while they were having that competition. So that is an example of a competition that could have been relocated to another field on campus.
Another question in the chat. Stephanie W. asks, is the 925 student size taking into account a long-range population? Would a new school be able to accommodate if the populations grew significantly?
Oh,
Yeah, the 925 number I think is a solid number. So the current enrollment of NASHOBA High School prior to our graduates is 887 students. And when we account for what our population trends are in town and the number of units it would take, at an 85% utilization rate and 925 students, 100% would be up to, I'm going to grab this if I remember it, 1,086 actual students in the building. So to give you some context of that number, 1,086, never in Neshoba Regional High School history have we reached that number in population. So I think 925 is a good number at the 85% utilization rate.
and if I could just add to that, that is based on a demographics report that was done by a third-party investigation to arrive at that number through historical data and projections.
No other questions yet.
Yes, there were. We don't have that with us tonight, but it is available probably on the school building website, which
Yes, that's on the school building website. You
the
can see
school
that
buil-
report.
Yep, which if you scan the QR code, we have a presentation where we discussed all of that. Yep, you're welcome. Sorry, just for anybody at home that didn't hear the question, it was asked if we explored what, if any, sites did we explore other than the high school site?
It does give us an opportunity to plug the school building website where all the artifacts, documents, and reports are currently being housed. So I do encourage people to scan that QR code or go directly to it through a link on the nrsd.net website. Any other questions we have from our audience tonight?
Nothing in the chat right now.
Oh, we got one.
Yeah, I can answer that. It is a priority. It's not something we've talked about other than just briefly in any of our previous presentations, but it's something that is identified as a priority for the district. It's something that we know that is important to the communities, and they've identified it as values, and is even in the educational visioning, it was a value. So yes, sustainable design is an important element to this. So we'll be exploring both passive and active measures from a sustainable design to the point that we anticipate that the project will be trying to achieve additional reimbursement for the project through the sustainable design goals for the project from the state. And that's just, again, to offset the cost of building a more sustainable building. So that is a very high priority in the project, yes.
It's also one of the requirements that we reach certain criteria and certain levels with sustainability in the project as a partner with the state. So we have, we will exceed what the state requires as a minimum, and that will allow the project to reach that additional reimbursement potentially. So it is not only, we understand it's the goals of this community in particular, but it is also a requirement.
Yeah, I think we'll just wrap up and thank everybody for coming out today. I want to thank all of our friends from Skanska and KBA for joining us tonight. It is an opportunity also for me to say to the audience in front of us here today and everybody at home or on ball fields, on your cell phones where you're watching, stay engaged with us. This is going to be an important project. This is the future of our school system we're talking about. And ultimately, when we get to that place of understanding what kind of project we're going to have, we need community engagement on getting out the word, knocking on those doors, and informing people about the accuracies of what this potential project has for us, but most importantly for the children of our school system. So we thank you all for coming out tonight, and we look forward to seeing you at the next community event. Have a good night.